My driver had been incapacitated by a sudden injury during the loading, and with the historic storm closing in, I couldn't wait for a replacement. I took the wheel of the lead heavy supply truck myself. I was a lieutenant commander, yes, but I wasn't about to let a $4 million cargo sit idle while the coast turned into a graveyard of salt and steel. The wind screamed, and my wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. Vision was zero. Then, a flash of lightning revealed a silhouette. A dark SUV, flipped and drowning in a flood pool. Emergency Decree 12B was etched in my mind. 0 unauthorized stops during strategic medical transport. But then, I saw the child. She was turning blue, gasping for air from an empty inhaler. My orders said drive. My heart said save her. I chose the child. Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world go by, makes me realize how life hinges on one split-second choice. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what your favorite drink is right now. I'm truly looking forward to your comments. But for me, that exhausted dawn back at the base was just the beginning. I pulled into the San Diego base as the sun began to bleed through the grey clouds, signaling a dawn I was too exhausted to welcome. My uniform was a second skin of salt and freezing rain, and every muscle in my body felt like it had been replaced with lead. I did not head for the showers. I did not head for my bunk. I followed the note on my desk, straight to the administration wing. I had not slept in 22 hours, but the adrenaline of the storm was still humming in my veins, sharp and cold. The door to the inner office clicked open. "The commander will see you now," his aide barked. I straightened my damp jacket, stepped inside, and offered a perfect salute. Commander Gary did not return it. He sat behind a mahogany desk that smelled of expensive wax and ego, his hair groomed with mathematical precision. He did not look like a man who had spent the night worrying about anyone. He looked like a man who spent his life protecting a spreadsheet. Without a word, he slid a document across the desk. I did not need to read the title to know what it was. A formal reprimand. Disobedience of Emergency Decree 12B. I looked at the black ink, and then up at his impassive face. "You compromised a strategic medical shipment valued at over $4 million, Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice clipped and clinical. "You abandoned a secure timeline for an unsanctioned civilian interaction. Do you have any idea how much risk you created for this base?" "There was a child, sir," I said. My voice was level, devoid of the tremor he was clearly waiting for. A medical emergency, within a storm. The equipment I was carrying was meant to save lives. It felt contradictory to drive past one that was ending right in front of me. Gary slammed his pen onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. A child does not override a maritime directive. Logistics is not a charity. It is a science of precision. You spent over a decade building an impeccable career, Olivia. Don't throw it all away for a dying civilian. I cannot allow sentiment to infect my operation. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing with a dark kind of satisfaction. You are stripped of field command. I'm not court-martialing you yet, Olivia. That would create too much paperwork for a hero wannabe, Gary sneered. Instead, I'm burying you in Hangar 4. You'll audit dusty labels and dead inventory until your discharge papers are finalized. Consider it a slow walk to the exit. You will be counting labels in the back of Hangar 4. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I did not even flinch. I simply looked at the document, memorizing the signature. To Gary, this was a punishment meant to break my spirit. To me, it was a transaction. My compassion had been a luxury his department had overdrawn for years, and now I was simply closing the account. "I will need a signed copy of this reprimand for my personal records, sir," I said. He blinked, clearly thrown by my lack of emotion. He signed it with a flourish and handed it over. As I turned to leave, I saw Tyler leaning in the doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand and a smirk on his face. Tyler had always been Gary's hand-picked protege, Even though he was only a lieutenant, a full rank below my position as lieutenant commander, his proximity to the commander's inner circle made him feel untouchable. He didn't see a superior officer anymore. He saw a fallen rival. Tyler, who had finished second to me at the academy and had been waiting for my first stumble. "Tough break, valedictorian," he whispered as I brushed past. "Maybe you can find a way to save the world from behind a keyboard. Just try not to get any tears on the paperwork." I did not answer. Anger was not loud this time. It was methodical. I walked toward the warehouse, the weight of the reprimand in my hand, feeling like a different kind of weapon. They were not shocked by what they had done. They were just shocked that I had stopped playing along. But as I looked at the dusty rows of Hangar 4, I realized Gary had made a lethal mistake. Gary thought Hangar 4 was a graveyard for forgotten records. He made a fatal mistake. He forgot that 5 years ago, I was the officer who designed the digital filing system for this entire base. I knew exactly where the ghosts were hidden in the paper trail. As I audited the lost shipments, the numbers began to scream his name. He had given the best logistics mind on this base total access to his private paper trail. This was not a demotion. It was an audit. The back of Hangar 4 was where the Navy sent its forgotten relics and its political problems. The air was thick with the scent of oxidized metal and the heavy silence of a place that time had passed by. I sat at a scarred grey desk under the hum of a single flickering fluorescent bulb. Gary thought he had buried me, but he had actually given me exactly what I needed, a vantage point. I looked at the stack of old logs, my mind drifting to the 3 commendations, sitting at the bottom of my locker. 10 years of impeccable service. I had spent a decade being the perfect soldier, the silent investor in their version of order. I knew that rules were meant to be a framework for safety, a guardrail for human judgment, not a noose. That night, in the storm, when the child was suffocating, I was not choosing to break a rule. I was choosing to honor the reason the rules existed in the first place, to protect life. My quiet acceptance of this demotion was not weakness. It was the invisible chain of a survivor. In the military, they teach you that sometimes you have to go dark to stay alive. My silence was a tactical choice, a way to move through the shadows. While Gary and Tyler were busy celebrating their petty victory, they saw a victim. I saw a data set. As I began entering the inventory data for the last 6 months, my logistics training took over. My eyes started catching the inconsistencies before my brain even processed them. The fuel logs for the transport runs did not align with the medical cargo weight manifests. It was subtle. A missing crate here, a miscalculated gallon there. But for a logistics specialist who graduated at the top of her class, these were not just errors. They were dancing numbers. I pulled a ledger from 2 months ago. Gary's signature was on every approval line. I cross-referenced it with the emergency supply requests from the regional clinics. The clinics were reporting shortages of the exact same high-value equipment I had been hauling during the storm. According to the warehouse records, that equipment had already been delivered, but according to the transport logs, the trucks had left half empty. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for my situation, but there was only clinical clarity. Gary had not demoted me to hide me away. He had demoted me to use my mistake as a smokescreen for his own. He was bleeding the base dry, and he thought a disgraced officer would be too broken to notice the stain on his hands. He was wrong. Inside this dusty hangar, I was not just counting labels, I was building a balance sheet of his crimes. The morning briefing began with the sharp smell of floor wax and the low hum of nervous officers. Gary stood at the front, holding my reprimand up like a trophy. I sat in the back row, my face a mask of indifference. "Logistics is not a charity," he boomed, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me. "It is precision. When one officer decides their feelings matter more than the mission, the entire chain of command is compromised." He spent the next 15 minutes using me as a textbook example of failure to deter the entire unit. Tyler grinned from across the room, scribbling something in his notebook. I did not feel the sting of embarrassment. I felt the cold, analytical click of a trap being set. After the briefing, Gary handed me a tablet. "You will be performing a full inventory audit of the shipment from the night of the storm," he ordered. "Every box, every serial number. I want to know exactly how much your incompetence cost us." He thought he was rubbing salt in the wound. He did not realize he was giving me the keys to the crime scene. I spent the afternoon in the cold, damp cargo bay of the supply truck. The medical crates sat there, silent and heavy. As I scanned the barcodes, I noticed the weight sensors in the floor did not match the manifest. The shipment was supposed to be £4,000, but the digital readout showed 3,200, 800 pounds of high-value surgical equipment had vanished into thin air. I moved to the maintenance hangar, where Chief Petty Officer Donald was working on a disassembled engine. Donald was 58 years old, with grease under his fingernails and a memory like an encrypted hard drive. He did not look up when I approached. "Rough day, ma'am?" he asked. "You could say that," I replied. I leaned against the workbench, keeping my voice low. "Donald, how often does the transport schedule change? On short notice during a storm?" He stopped wiping a wrench and looked at me, his eyes sharp and guarded. "More than you would think. Gary likes the cover of a historic storm, says it tests our resilience, but usually no one is around to check the weight. The trucks leave, and the logs get signed the next morning, when the rain has washed everything away." He told me about several other shipments over the last few months, all occurring during extreme weather, all signed off by Gary, and all reporting inventory that never seemed to arrive in full. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. This was not just a pattern of bad timing. It was a systematic embezzlement scheme. Gary had been rerouting crates before they reached the base, using the chaos of the storms to hide the missing inventory. My unauthorized stop had not just delayed a shipment, it had threatened to expose a delivery that was already light. He had used my reprimand as a smokescreen to distract from the theft he had orchestrated. I was not just a disgraced officer. I was the perfect scapegoat for a multi-million-dollar crime. But Gary had forgotten one thing. I was not just a data entry clerk. I was the person who knew exactly where those crates should have been. And I was about to prove that his version of duty was nothing but a criminal enterprise. The air over the base shattered as the rhythmic thump of a specialized helicopter echoed against the coastal cliffs. I looked up from my spreadsheets as a sleek bird bearing the 4-star insignia of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations touched down on the main pad. Admiral Frank had arrived without warning. Commander Gary was practically vibrating, with a frantic, nervous energy, adjusting his medals in the reflection of the glass doors as if he were auditioning for the role of a lifetime. He believed this was his moment of ascent, the final audit, before a promotion he felt he had earned, through his manufactured version of mathematical precision. I was called to the command briefing room an hour later. Gary was already there, standing at attention, with a folder full of success stories and polished data points. But Admiral Frank was not looking at the reports. Spread across the oak table, he was staring at the doorway. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was not the suffocating heat of Gary's anger anymore. It was the heavy, cold gravity of true authority. Admiral Frank did not ask for a logistics brief or a summary of fuel efficiency. He looked Gary in the eye and asked for the record of the officer who had handled the transport on the night of the historic storm 2 weeks ago. Gary's voice was thick, with manufactured disappointment, as he explained that I was the one who had compromised the timeline and jeopardized strategic cargo. He thought he was burying me in front of the most powerful man in the division. He did not see the Admiral's knuckles whiten as he gripped the edge of the table. Then, the silence broke. "Commander," Frank said, his voice a low rumble that felt like approaching thunder. "The family in that SUV, the man, the woman, and the child struggling for breath, that was my daughter and my only grandson. You did not just save a civilian vehicle. You saved the only legacy I have left. The storm hadn't just brought rain. It had decimated the local cell towers and washed out the main bridge. The Admiral's daughter had taken a backroad detour that turned into a trap. They were ghost signals on the grid, unreachable, invisible, until Olivia's convoy happened to pass that exact stretch of flooded highway. Gary's face did not just pale. It looked as if the colour had been physically stripped from his skin. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Admiral Frank looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the profound weight behind the stars on his shoulders. He had been watching this base from a distance for 14 days, observing the fallout of that night in silence. He told me later that he had waited, caught in a silent struggle between the hope that the leaders he had trained would recognize valor and the sickening reality that they were using rules to punish human decency. He had been the silent watcher, a man torn between the integrity of the service and the lives of his own blood. He had given Gary 2 weeks to show 1 ounce of leadership, 1 spark of moral judgment. Gary had spent every one of those days proving he was not fit to lead anything but a machine. Recognition crashed through Gary like a physical blow. He was not just a commanding officer anymore. He was a man who'd been caught trying to destroy the savior of the Admiral's own family to protect a lie. This was not a policy review. This was a reckoning. Gary's voice was a dry rasp as he tried to invoke the holy scripture of Navy logistics one last time. He stood stiffly, his eyes darting toward the Admiral as he stammered about strategic cargo integrity and the sanctity of maritime directives. He was still trying to hide behind Emergency Decree 12B, clinging to it like a life raft in a rising tide. But the Admiral was not looking for a lecture on protocol. He was looking for a leader. And all he saw was a man terrified of the truth. I did not wait for Gary's permission to speak. I stepped forward and placed the audit tablet on the oak table, sliding it toward Admiral Frank. Cargo integrity was compromised long before I reached that SUV, Admiral, I said. My voice was clinical, a sharp contrast to Gary's frantic, uneven breathing. During my reassignment to warehouse operations, I performed a full audit of the shipments from the last 6 months. 800 pounds of high-value surgical equipment from the night of the storm never arrived at the base. It was rerouted under the cover of the hurricane, signed off using Commander Gary's CAT credentials. He had left his unique electronic thumbprint on every stolen dollar, thinking no one in Hangar 4 would ever have the clearance or the courage to look. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched as the Admiral scrolled through the data I had compiled with Chief Donald's help. The ledger did not lie. Gary had not sent me into that storm to test my resilience. He had sent me because he needed a scapegoat for the inventory he had already stolen. He hoped the storm would swallow the evidence, and when I stopped to save a life, he saw a perfect opportunity to bury me under a reprimand, so no one would look at his books. "Sir, I can explain," Gary started, but the Admiral stood up slowly, and the sound of his chair scraping against the floor was like a death knell. His presence filled the room with a weight that made the walls feel like they were closing in. "You did not just fail your officers, Commander," Frank said, his voice cold enough to cut steel. "You used the uniform to facilitate theft and then punished an officer for the very decency you lack." Frank walked over to Gary and stopped inches from his face. "Commander Gary, your service to this Navy is terminated, effective immediately under my emergency authority. Hand over your insignia." Before Gary could blink, the Admiral's hand moved with military precision, ripping the rank from Gary's shoulder. "MP, escort this man to the brig. We'll let the Jag sort out the rest of his life." The metallic click of the pins was the only sound in the room. It was the ultimate power flip. In a heartbeat, Gary transformed from a powerful commander into a hollow man in a white shirt. This was the pathetic reality of a person who lived as an illusion of power. Gary was an empty bag. He had spent his career building a status based on a title and a rigid adherence to rules, but he had no internal substance to hold it up. His authority was a borrowed uniform, a shell that collapsed the second the Admiral stopped believing in the lie. Without the military rank to shield his character, Gary was nothing but a common thief, caught in his own trap. "You are relieved of command, effective immediately," Admiral Frank declared, You will be escorted to your quarters and remain there pending a full court-martial for embezzlement and fraud. Gary did not argue. He did not even look up. He just stood there, diminished and broken, as the security team entered the room to take him away. He had traded his honor for crates of medical supplies, and in the end, the balance sheet had finally come due. The promotion ceremony was not grand. There were no brass bands, no flashing cameras, and no speeches rehearsed to death by the Public Affairs Office. It was just a handful of us gathered in the hangar bay, where the air still smelled of salt, diesel, and jet fuel. Sunlight poured through the open doors, glinting off the water and the rows of polished aircraft. Yet, as I stood at attention before Admiral Frank, my hands were trembling. The Admiral stepped forward, holding a small velvet box. Inside sat a single silver oak leaf, the rank of commander. He pinned the insignia onto my shoulder himself, leaning in to whisper so only I could hear, "Some lessons take a storm to be remembered. You have taught one to the entire chain of command." Behind me, the sailors broke into a soft, steady applause. I saw Chief Donald in the back row, his weathered hands clapping harder than anyone's, a rare grin cutting through his grease-stained face. Admiral Frank turned to address the unit, his voice firm and unmistakable. "Every rule we write exists for a reason," he said, "but no rule, no procedure, and no checklist will ever outweigh the value of a human life." Commander Olivia knew that when others forgot. Let this base remember that leadership is not measured in perfect reports. It is measured in moral courage. For a long, reverent moment, silence filled the hangar, and even the gulls outside seemed to pause. One by one, the officers who had once avoided my gaze in the hallways came up to shake my hand. Tyler was the last to approach. He looked smaller than I remembered, his posture uncertain, the smugness completely drained from his eyes. "Congrats, Commander," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You earned it." I gave him a small, clinical smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant." He hesitated, looking at his boots. "I did not understand back then about what you did." I looked him in the eye. Most people do not, until they are the ones standing in the storm. He nodded and left without another word. A year has passed since that day. The storms still hit the San Diego coast every spring, but I have stopped fearing the sound of thunder. It serves as a reminder that life's hardest weather often cleans the air. I now lead Project Samaritan, the humanitarian logistics division Admiral Frank envisioned. Our mission is simple. We deliver supplies during floods, hurricanes, and fires across the coast. On the door of every transport truck, we have painted the motto, "Order serves people, or it serves nothing." One afternoon, I received a letter from Washington. The handwriting was neat, but shaky. It was from Rhett Gary. He wrote, "I heard about the program you're running. You were right. I spent my career thinking leadership meant control. You showed me it means conscience. I have applied for a volunteer post with the Red Cross. Maybe it is time I learn what real logistics is." I set the letter down on my desk, right next to a framed, grainy photo taken from a motel security camera on a rainy night, a truck towing a stranded SUV through the dark. I felt no bitterness, only closure. Standing on the pier that evening, I looked out at the molten gold of the setting sun. I have come to realize that your worth is not defined by the insignia on your shoulder or the title on your door. Those are just borrowed shells. True honor is what you do when the manual runs out and the lights go dark. It is the courage to be human in a system that sometimes forgets how to be. If you find yourself in a similar situation, feeling like the black sheep because you choose your heart over a heartless rule, remember this. You are not the problem. You are the survivor. You are the silent investor in a better world, and your integrity is a currency that never devalues. Forgiveness is not always for the person who hurt you. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free and finally hear your own voice above the noise. I have learned that the best revenge is not destruction. It is building a life so bright that the shadows of your past can no longer find a place to hide. One act of mercy can change an entire chain of command. Never regret doing the right thing, even if it costs you everything at first. Because justice always knows its way back home. Honor really lies in the choices made in the dark, where it is just you and your own conscience. If Olivia's story has given you strength, please share it to spread belief in integrity. Have you ever had to choose between a rule and humanity? Please leave your story in the comments below.